Have you ever noticed how some people simply stop showing up? Not with an argument, not with a dramatic announcement, not with any of the explanations the situation seemed to deserve, just a gradual thinning of presence, a withdrawal so quiet that by the time anyone thought to ask, the distance had already become a kind of permanent weather. And maybe you have wondered about someone like that in your own life, or maybe, and this is the question worth sitting with, maybe you recognize that person as yourself. What if the disappearance was never indifference? What if the silence was not absence of feeling, but its overflow? And what if the people who vanish most quietly from the rooms they once filled are not the ones who care least, but the ones who have grown so acutely, almost painfully aware of what is actually happening in those rooms, that remaining there has become a kind of slow interior erosion, the cost of staying too high, not in comfort or convenience, but in something closer to the self. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that the fundamental substance of all life is will, not a noble, intentional will aimed at good purposes, but a blind, insatiable drive that pushes through every living thing without destination or mercy. We are, in his view, expressions of that force, thrown into consciousness without being asked, condemned to want and to suffer and to want again. This is not a comfortable philosophy. It is not meant to be. But there is something in it that the person who has grown quiet will recognize immediately, not as a theory, but as a lived experience they never quite had words for. Because Schopenhauer also observed something that most of his contemporaries preferred not to examine, that clarity comes at a price. The more clearly a mind perceives the machinery underneath ordinary life, the vanity inside ambition, the fear inside aggression, the loneliness inside constant sociability, the harder it becomes to participate in the performance as though you had not seen it. Intelligence, in his framing, is not a gift that makes life easier. It is a burden that makes life more transparent. And transparency, it turns out, is not always welcome, least of all in a crowd that has agreed, without ever stating it, to keep certain things comfortably blurred. Perhaps this is where the quiet disappearance begins. Not in a decision, not in a grievance, but in a kind of perceptual fatigue, the exhaustion of someone who cannot stop noticing. You walk into a conversation, and you hear not only what is being said, but what is being carefully avoided. You sit at a table, and you feel not only the warmth of company, but the subtle negotiations of ego happening just below the surface, the unspoken hierarchies, the performance of ease that costs everyone present more than they will admit. You do not choose to see this. You simply cannot choose not to. And the weight of that is real. It is a particular kind of loneliness to be surrounded by people who are genuinely enjoying something you can only observe, not because you are superior. That framing is both wrong and unkind, but because your mind will not settle into the comfortable middle distance that makes ordinary social life feel effortless. Schopenhauer saw genius, in its broadest sense, as a form of excess sensitivity, a nervous system tuned to frequencies that most instruments are mercifully unable to pick up. The word genius here carries none of the flattery it usually does. It is closer to a diagnosis than a compliment. To perceive more than the situation requires is not a power. It is, much of the time, simply more to carry. What begins to happen slowly is this: the intelligent person, not the academically decorated person, but the person whose inner life runs deeper and faster than their circumstances reward, starts to perform a kind of internal accounting. The energy spent translating themselves into terms others will find acceptable, the effort of softening observations that, stated plainly, would disturb the atmosphere everyone has agreed to maintain, the quiet work of making yourself smaller, not smaller in pride, but smaller in presence, contracting around the parts of you that have learned they are too much for the room. And at some point, the arithmetic stops working. The cost of staying visible exceeds whatever warmth visibility still provides. Not dramatically, not with a reckoning or a confrontation, just quietly, the way a tide withdraws, leaving the shore exactly as it found it, and the shore barely noticing until the water has been gone a long time. Imagine a creature that has spent its entire life in the deep ocean, where the pressure is constant and the light does not exist. It does not experience the dark as deprivation. The dark is simply the condition of its world, the medium through which it moves and knows itself. Now imagine that creature, driven by some interior compulsion it cannot name, beginning to rise, slowly, over years, toward the surface. And as it rises, the water changes, the pressure eases, and the light begins to arrive, first as a dim suggestion, then as something more insistent, then as something that, at a certain depth, becomes genuinely unbearable. Not because the light is wrong, but because eyes shaped by total darkness were never built to receive it all at once. This is perhaps what happens to the intelligent person who has spent years learning to see clearly in conditions that did not reward clarity. The ascent itself is the injury, not the destination, the motion. The slow, involuntary process of becoming someone who can no longer pretend not to notice what they notice. And what they notice, increasingly, is the gap between what is said and what is meant. Between the warmth people perform and the indifference they return to the moment the performance is no longer required. Between the version of yourself you are invited to bring into a room and the version that actually exists, waiting outside the door. Carl Jung gave a name to the version invited in. He called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is not a deception, Jung was careful to say. It is a necessary instrument of social life, the face we compose for the world so that the world can receive us without being overwhelmed. Every person wears one. The question is not whether you have a persona, but whether the distance between the persona and the self beneath it has grown so wide that crossing it each day has become its own form of exhaustion. For the person whose inner life runs at a register most of their surroundings cannot quite tune to, that distance tends to become very wide indeed. The mask is refined over years of careful observation. What lands, what disturbs, what must be softened, what can never be said. The work is unconscious at first, instinctive, the ordinary adaptation of a social animal. But somewhere along the way it stops being adaptation and starts being subtraction. You are no longer adjusting yourself to fit a context. You are removing yourself, piece by piece, to avoid the discomfort your wholeness causes in others. And the terrible efficiency of this process is that it works. The rooms get quieter, the friction decreases. People find you agreeable, easy, low maintenance. What they do not know, what you may have half forgotten yourself, is that the person they find agreeable is the residue, the part that survived the editing. How many rooms did you learn to make yourself smaller to enter? How many conversations did you steer away from the thing you actually wanted to say because you had already mapped the discomfort it would create and decided the map was not worth walking? How many times did you laugh at something that did not strike you as funny, not out of dishonesty but out of a kind of exhausted generosity? The decision that this moment was not worth the cost of being yourself in it. How many relationships did you maintain at a level of depth that never quite reached the place where you actually live, because every time you moved toward that place, the other person grew visibly uncomfortable and you learned, quietly and without drama, to stop? These are not accusations, they are an inventory. The kind the intelligent person carries out alone, late, when the persona has been set down for the night, and the actual self is briefly and unexpectedly present. Jung believed that the sustained suppression of the self, in service of the persona, did not leave the suppressed material inert. It accumulated. It found its way into the shadow, that reservoir of everything we have been taught to hide, including, crucially, not only our darkness, but our unlived brightness, our unclaimed capacities, the parts of ourselves we abandoned, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient for the people we were trying to keep close. The withdrawal, then, the quiet disappearance that this reflection began with, is perhaps not a retreat at all. Perhaps it is the first honest response the self has been permitted to make in a very long time. And there is a distinction worth sitting with here, because not all loneliness is the same thing, even when it wears the same face. There is the loneliness that is inflicted, the kind that arrives without your consent, that finds you in a crowded room where everyone is speaking and none of it reaches you. The kind that follows rejection, or abandonment, or the slow, wordless discovery that someone you trusted was never quite seeing you at all. That loneliness is a wound. It asks to be healed. But there is another kind, the loneliness that is chosen, not in a single dramatic moment, but chosen quietly, incrementally, the way a person learns to close a window against noise that has gone on too long. This is the loneliness of the person who has begun to prefer their own silence to conversations that cost them something they cannot name but can always feel. It is not numbness. It is, perhaps, the opposite of numbness. It is what happens when perception becomes too precise to be comfortable in spaces that have never been designed for precision. Schopenhauer observed that the more clearly a person sees, the more they see what others are content not to see. The motivations dressed as generosity, the performance dressed as sincerity, the fear dressed as certainty. He did not mean this as contempt for other people. He meant it as an accounting of what clarity costs. And the cost is not cruelty. The cost is a particular kind of solitude that cannot be fully explained to someone who has not felt it, the way you cannot explain a color to someone who has never seen that part of the spectrum. This is the loneliness the intelligent person often cannot justify to anyone around them. How do you say, "I withdrew not because I am broken, but because staying was breaking me"? How do you say, "The room was full, and I was the only one who noticed the room"? Imagine a clock, not an old decorative one, but a working clock, accurate, one that had spent years in a house where every schedule revolved around its face. The family had learned to glance at it without gratitude, the way you stop hearing a sound that has always been present. But the clock had also learned something. Slowly, over the accumulated weight of years, it had learned to run fast, then slow, adjusting itself not to actual time, but to the moods of the house, rushing through the hours that were painful, stretching the hours that were peaceful, bending its own nature to manage the emotional rhythm of people who never once asked whether the clock had a rhythm of its own. And then one morning, the clock stopped, not because it was broken, because something in its mechanism had finally refused to continue performing a function it had never been built to perform. The family called it a malfunction. What it was, perhaps, was the first accurate thing the clock had done in years, an admission, finally, that it could not keep two times at once, its own and everyone else's. The intelligent person who disappears is often that clock. They have been keeping two times simultaneously, the time the world requires and the time their interior life is actually living, and the withdrawal is what happens when that doubling finally becomes unsustainable. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone whose presence asked you to run fast or slow, to bend your internal rhythm to serve theirs. And if you think carefully, you will notice that the pattern does not belong to that person alone. It has appeared before, with a different face, in a different room, with a different name attached to the same invisible demand. There is a video in the pinned first comment below this one that examines exactly why that pattern repeats and what it is actually selecting for in the people you allow close. It is worth watching before you assign the next chapter of your life to the same dynamic. Now, what is the withdrawal actually protecting? Jung's answer, arrived at through decades of clinical observation, was that the shadow, that accumulated reservoir of everything suppressed, does not go quiet simply because the persona is performing well. It presses, and the withdrawal is often the first moment in which the shadow is allowed to press without immediately being suppressed again. What feels to the outside world like distance, like coldness, like an inexplicable disappearance, is sometimes, on the inside, the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the long and uncomfortable process of integrating what was exiled back into the self that exiled it. The unlived brightness returns here. The opinion that was never voiced, the boundary that was swallowed, the desire that was translated into something more acceptable before it was illubiclames, allowed to exist in its full form. And perhaps this is the most disorienting part of the withdrawal, that it does not feel like strength. It feels like failure. It feels like giving up. There is a voice that says, a more evolved person would stay, a more patient person would explain, a more generous person would keep showing up. But what that voice never mentions is that you have been showing up, and that each time you did, you left a little more of yourself at the door. Imagine a clock, not a decorative one, but an old working clock, the kind whose entire purpose is to be accurate. For years, this clock has been quietly adjusted, not by its own mechanism, but by the people in the room who found its accuracy inconvenient. A meeting ran long, so someone nudged it forward. A conversation needed to end sooner, so someone pushed the hands back. Slowly, the clock was no longer keeping time. It was keeping peace, and the room grew to depend not on what the clock actually said, but on what the room needed it to say. One day, the clock stopped. Not because it broke, because somewhere in its mechanism, the only way to become accurate again was to stop accommodating the inaccuracies of everyone around it. The room called this a malfunction. The clock had simply decided to tell the truth. You have been that clock. Not in some dramatic, definitive moment, but across 1,000 small adjustments. The thing you agreed to that you did not believe. The reaction you softened so the other person would not have to sit with discomfort. The version of yourself you presented because the real version had been received, before, with silence or impatience or a change of subject. Each adjustment was small. Together they amounted to a life lived slightly off. The withdrawal, then, is not abandonment. It is recalibration. And here is where the reframe becomes important, because the mind resists it. We are trained to read disappearance as loss, loss of connection, loss of warmth, loss of participation in the world of other people. But perhaps not every absence is a loss. Perhaps some absences are the only honest response to an environment that required you to be less than you are. The philosopher in you, and there is one, even if you have never named it that, understands that clarity sometimes has no social form, that there is no polite way to say, I am not able to keep performing this version of myself. That the withdrawal is not a door closing on others. It is a door, perhaps for the first time, opening toward yourself. Schopenhauer, who spent long stretches of his life in deliberate solitude, did not romanticize it. He recognized it as costly. But he also recognized that the alternative, constant movement among people who were not asking the questions that mattered to him, was a different kind of cost, one paid in smaller installments but eventually totaling more. The withdrawal of the intelligent, the perceptive, the quietly exhausted, is not superiority. It is not misanthropy dressed in philosophical clothes. It is something far more ordinary and far more tender than that. And this is where compassion becomes essential, because without it, the reflection curdles. The people who did not understand your silence, they were not cruel. Or if some of them were, their cruelty was not the whole of them. They were, and are, living inside their own version of the story, with their own invisible accommodations, their own suppressed inventory, their own clock that was nudged one too many times. They experienced your withdrawal as rejection, and that experience was real. It hurt them. Understanding this does not mean returning to something that was costing you your coherence, but it does mean that the story you carry forward does not need a villain in it. Silence, in the end, is not indifference. Silence can be the most careful thing a person offers, the refusal to speak before they know what is true, the refusal to perform warmth that has gone hollow, the refusal to fill space with words that would only delay the honesty that both people deserve. Those who read your silence as coldness were perhaps looking for a mirror and finding instead a window. You were not reflecting them back, you were seeing through. And perhaps that is the most disorienting thing about clarity. It cannot be switched off once it arrives. You do not get to return to the comfortable version of the room after you have seen what the room actually contains. The window does not close. And so the silence that others read as withdrawal is often something quieter and stranger than that. It is the pause of someone who has seen too clearly to speak carelessly and not yet found language precise enough to speak honestly. There is a kind of intelligence that is not celebrated in social settings. It does not perform. It does not fill pauses with agreeable noise. It watches, and it waits, and when it finally speaks, what it says lands differently than expected, not because it is trying to unsettle anyone, but because it has been thinking about the actual thing, not the acceptable version of the thing. This kind of mind is often experienced by others as cold, or remote, or oddly exhausting to be around for long stretches. But what they are sensing is not coldness. What they are sensing is the weight of someone who refuses to pretend the ceiling is not there. Silence is the first language of self-respect. Not the silence of contempt, not the silence of defeat, but the silence that says, I will not fill this space with something I do not mean. I will not offer you a version of myself assembled for your comfort at the cost of my own coherence. That silence, when it comes after years of noise, after years of speaking the language others needed you to speak, laughing at the moment the room required a laugh, softening the edges of your observations so they would be received rather than felt, that silence is not a disappearance, it is an arrival. Imagine a craftsman who spent the better part of his life building furniture to other people's measurements, not because he lacked vision of his own, but because the measurements were always handed to him before he could ask a question, and the room was always already framed, and the wood was always already cut. He was fast, and he was good, and he became known for his precision in following instructions no one had to explain twice. And then one evening, after the last client had left and the workshop was empty, he sat down and looked at the tools laid out on his bench, and he realized, quietly, without drama, that he had never once in his working life built a single piece to his own dimensions. Not one. Every joint he had cut had been someone else's idea of where a joint should go. He did not rage at this. He was not even entirely sure it was a wrong life. But he put down the tool he was holding, and he sat with that realization for a very long time, and the sitting was not idleness. It was the first honest measurement he had ever taken, the measurement of himself, the true size of what he had given away. When he returned to the bench, he built something no one had commissioned. It was impractical and strange, and it did not fit any room he knew. But every joint was in the place he had chosen, and every proportion answered to something inside him he could not quite name, but had always dimly been aware of. He gave it away to no one. He placed it in the corner of the workshop, and he looked at it every morning before the clients arrived. This is what the withdrawal is, at its most honest. Not a punishment delivered to those left behind. Not a declaration of superiority. A craftsman returning, at last, to his own measurements. An instrument recalibrating to its own internal tone rather than the frequency of the nearest, loudest room. And that recalibration is fragile at first. It does not announce itself. It asks for quiet, for unhurried time, for the strange grace of an unscheduled afternoon. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of a silence that has not yet filled with new meaning, because that discomfort, that hollow suspended moment, is the very space in which something genuine can begin to form. Most people flee it. They reach for their phone, or they manufacture a social occasion, or they tell themselves that so much introspection is self-indulgence. But perhaps what they are fleeing is not emptiness at all. Perhaps they are fleeing the specific and terrifying freedom of having no one else's measurements to follow. So here you are, at the edge of your own quiet, perhaps for the first time in a long while, not performing, not adjusting, not measuring yourself against a room that was never built to hold you. And the question I want to leave with you, the one worth carrying into the ordinary hours of tomorrow, into the moment when someone's impatience brushes against your slower rhythm, or when you feel the old reflex beginning to stir, the reflex to make yourself smaller, easier, more convenient. The question is this: what would it cost you, honestly, to stop? Not forever, not dramatically, only to stop in that one moment and let yourself remain exactly as large as you are. Jung believed that individuation, the long, patient work of becoming who you actually are, was not a destination you arrived at. It was a direction you kept choosing, not once, in some hour of revelation, but again and again, in the small, ordinary moments when the pull toward the comfortable performance returned. The question is not whether you will feel that pull. You will. The question is only whether you recognize it now, for what it is. I want to say something to you directly, as the narrator of this reflection rather than only its guide. There was a period in my own life when I could not have sat with what we have been sitting with tonight. I kept myself extraordinarily busy, not because the work demanded it, but because stillness had become frightening. I had grown so accustomed to organizing myself around other people's needs, other people's clocks, other people's definitions of what a good use of time looked like, that genuine solitude felt less like rest and more like a verdict, as if the quiet itself were telling me something I was not ready to hear. What I eventually understood, slowly and with a great deal of resistance, is that the quiet was not a verdict. It was an invitation. And what it was inviting me toward was simply myself, unscheduled, unmeasured, occasionally inconvenient, and far more recognizable than I had been in years. If you have stayed with this reflection all the way to here, I suspect you know exactly what I mean. And I am grateful, genuinely, that you did. If what we have explored here has landed somewhere real for you, the pinned comment holds a video that takes the next step. It looks at the specific psychological mechanism behind the patterns we touched on tonight, and it gives you something more concrete to bring into your own life. It is waiting there whenever you are ready. If something in this reflection struck you, if a single sentence settled in your chest in a way that felt like recognition, I would ask you to do one thing. Write it in the comments below. Not a summary, not an analysis, just this, in your own words, quietly. I am allowed to take up space. 4 words, your own voice. Let that be the first thing you leave for yourself tonight, in a place where you can see it. And if this channel has become one of the places where you do your thinking, where you sit with things slowly rather than consuming them quickly, then consider subscribing. There are no algorithms being gamed here, no urgency being manufactured, only the next reflection, arriving when it is ready. We would be glad to have you here for it. Even the serious ones, I promise, occasionally contain a reason to stay.